And right from the start of this story, things are heating up. A young king in a medieval castle receives all the documentation of the surrender of the Principality of Sherdate, allowing the kingdom's expansion beyond the Halrek iron mine. A dream that has existed in this kingdom since the time the current king's father ruled this land. One of the people responsible for this victory, Margrave, is congratulated by His Majesty. The king had spent some time contemplating what reward he would give to his subordinate if successful, so he asks whether the man's heir has passed the marrying age due to the war. Considering that the royal family must take responsibility for this, the monarch wants to know how old young Eric is. Margrave informs him that his son is turning 24 this year, the number of the pampas deer in the animal lottery, which according to the king, is the perfect age to crush the rat of his dear sister, whom he loves deeply. With that said, Margrave begins to sweat profusely because this woman mentioned is known as the Caviar Princess. Nobody has ever seen or tasted her, just heard about her. In fact, there were rumors that the girl had already kicked the bucket and was announced as playing for Vasco da Gama, but now that the king has offered her up, it seems the rumors were unfounded. Speaking of which, the monarch explains that his officer will be the first man beyond the border to see the princess, because apparently he's kept the poor girl in a dungeon since birth. At least that's the only explanation left for this situation. It's hard to believe otherwise. But now we are introduced to the woman herself, the one everyone talks about, the mysterious and captive princess of the kingdom of Esquilor, Misa Esquilor. Dressed in a prisoner's tunic from Azkaban, the poor girl was looking around like Tarso from Caminho das Indias. Eric catches sight of Misa, and Misa catches sight of Eric. The king calls his sister closer since the poor girl is too shy, perhaps from being kept away from society her whole life, but who knows. However, as she's used to being chained to her bed in captivity, eating Cheetos and watching Hiroshi Manhwa on YouTube, the princess has forgotten how to walk properly, so she ends up tripping and falling to the ground like a tamale. The king remarks that she's not feeling great today, so it's best if everyone pretends they didn't see anything. He then asks her to get up, but by this point, the girl was already looking like the corpse bride on that cold, hard concrete floor. If she blinked, it was already a win. Awkward in the face of such a grotesque scene, Margrave thanks the king for the corpse, just as Eric promises not to use the body of the deceased princess for nefarious purposes. The king requests the young man to approach and get to know his wife better, so Eric walks toward the corpse, his blue cape swaying in the throne room, when suddenly he stops short of trampling his bride. He stands before her in a classic movie moment, where the song Waiting for a Girl Like You by Foreigner plays. He takes the princess's hand and claims it's an honor to meet her. However, the last time the young wildling saw another human being was when she had a stool test 3 years ago, so she freaks out and pulls her hand away, not afraid to be weird. The beast brother tells her not to treat her husband that way and calls her over for a pat on the head. Like a dog, the so-called princess barks and lifts her paw for more affection, leaving Eric with a "my god, I can't believe my dad gets the enemy's surrender, and I get a dog for a wife" kind of face. After this embarrassing moment, the noble family leaves that madhouse aboard their Ford 1347 carriage. Margrave reflects to himself that he had to sweat hard to give his son that dog, as he had to experience the horrors of a long war where the primary factor in their victory was the Chladni family. Of course, the king was jealous of not being the big boss in the story, so he planned this marriage just to mess with the Chladnis. That night, upon arriving home, all Margrave can do is vent to his pals. After all, he got a Yuga Buga princess raised in captivity in exchange for crushing the king's enemies in a bloody war. On the other hand, Eric understands that despite his thoughts on the princess, there's no way to disobey the king's orders. So he must tuck his tail between his legs, just like Misa, and do everything he's told, even though he is the handsome and charming Lord of Chladni. Eric's cousin Amberic asks if the engagement with the Crispin family went down the drain, and Margrave doesn't even need to answer, as the tyrannical madman just declared it so. The man asks if his wife, Thaliesa, also isn't furious with this arbitrary decision. Ignoring Brazil's time zone, Thaliesa turns with ellipses in her speech bubble and serves herself another round of fine wine. But as the booze spills across the panels, we are transported a few minutes back when a maid tried to convince the lady not to leave the princess in a separate room. Thaliesa replied that there's a passage connecting the rooms, as the nosy girl should know. But the maid insists that the princess isn't well, and her brain will turn to mush, which would surely irritate the king. Thaliesa believes this can be solved by hiring attendants, at which point the women go crazy, because the lady wants to leave the princess in the hands of people who don't even know how to clean their own butts. They claim the king will rip his hair out when he finds out. With a killer look, Thalassa stared straight at the maids and asked if they were implying that Eric needs to attend to the princess's needs. Buzzed from all this crazy kingly nonsense, Eric's mother now questions her family about how those harpies dared suggest that for the beloved heir of Chladni. Thalassa had surrendered to debauchery for emotional relief, but Eric remained steady as a wall. Days later, the least anticipated moment for House Chladni arrived. The announcement of the marriage between a brave knight returning victoriously from war and a noble princess was enough to make the people happy after such an intense conflict. However, Eric himself was far from any shred of joy about marrying a Labrador in a dress. Later, at the church hosting the wedding, the guests eagerly awaited the princess's revelation, as so far, all anyone knew was that this doomed girl existed, but no one had ever seen her face. Margrave and Thalassa just arrived, and the Lord learns that the king won't attend the wedding, driving him even more insane. Honestly, Margrave feels like that crowned serpent is making him a joke, so he resumes walking without any patience for this absurdity. The priest asks everyone to sit so the ceremony can begin, then requests the groom take his place at the pulpit. Wearing his Elvis Presley-style suit, Eric follows the recommendation until the church doors open with the expectation of the princess's arrival. It was indeed her, being carried by her maids as if she might collapse or flee at any moment. Some people wondered if she was okay, while others speculated she was drunk. When Misa finally reached the pulpit, struggling all the way, the priest quickly declared Eric Chladni and Misa of Esquilor as partners before the disaster of her barking randomly in the middle of the ceremony. With that, the priest licked his lips and announced it was time to kiss the bride. Without much thought, Eric planted a kiss on his wife and moved on with his life despite the adversity. At night, back at the Chladni family mansion, Eric received word from the maids that he mustn't hurt the lady on their wedding night in any way, and that tomorrow they will collect proof of the marriage consummation. Whatever that means, I hope it's not a photo of the two of them in bed. Without hesitation, Eric understood the situation and found Misa tied to her bed. He approached her slowly, removing his clothes while repeating the name of his dog. Oops, I mean wife. Suddenly, he notices 2 empty bottles of sedative on the bed, enough to knock out a whale or make Bob Marley seem sober backstage at one of his concerts. These sedatives were enough to leave the girl in a state of helplessness, a punishment even prisoners of war don't receive. Eric wonders how any son of a B** could do this to this girl so easily, and concludes that no one would have the courage to do so unless it were by order of the king himself, given that she is his sister. With that deduction, the Lord freaks out, unties the girl, and covers her up, as her body temperature had dropped significantly. In a moment of stupidity, he asks if the girl is okay, then remembers she drank 2 gallons of morphine, and her brain is probably floating somewhere between Jupiter and Saturn. Just as he untied her feet, the gentleman unties the girl's hands and notices the redness left on her fingertips from being bound for so long. After freeing her, he concluded that there was only one way to prevent the poor girl from freezing to death. So he asked Misa to move aside as he climbed under the covers naked. Being all sweet and caring, Eric explained that he was from the Chladni family, 24 years old, and had no siblings. He did have a younger sister, but she was lost in an accident when they were kids. Eric explained that he had spent his whole life at the border because of the war against the Principality of Sherde, but now he would spend the rest of it alongside Misa. At least, that's what the king asked of him. After concluding his presentation, Eric wondered if the girl could even hear anything, but the truth was that her brain was more fried than the steak I forgot on the stove last night. Either way, he thought it best to tell her what the heck was going on. He explained that winter on the frontier was brutal, and freezing starts at the body's extremities until you turn into a human popsicle, so it was essential to keep the blood flowing from the tips of her little body. While giving this lecture on uncomfortable temperatures, Eric saw the girl's skin gradually returning to normal, so he figured she'd be okay if she rested a bit longer. But the issue was that he needed to create evidence of the wedding night, and Eric considered sending a photo of him on top of Misa to the kingdom's WhatsApp group. But since social media didn't exist back then, he had to improvise after seeing 2 empty glasses in the room. The next day, he presented the evidence to the cleaning ladies, a cloth supposedly with the blood of a broken hymen, though I'd bet it was wine. The maids took the cloth to deliver it to the priest, and then went to dress the princess, but the Lord stopped them, saying the girl was still knocked out and needed more rest. So the maids accepted this without further question and left without fuss. When Eric returned to the room, he heard the sound of some animal gnawing on something, but we all know it wasn't any beast, right? Yes, it was Misa Esquiller in her animal mode, chewing on the blanket without a care in the world. He tried to teach the princess that she shouldn't eat the blanket, but apparently she didn't understand or was just a stubborn wild animal. Who knows? Either way, Eric assumed his wife was hungry, so he grabbed one of those overly heavy bakery croissants with cheap sausage filling and handed it to the famished girl. With nothing to lose, Misa snatched the food from the Lord's hand and stuffed it into her mouth without mercy. He then looked at her with genuine joy, grateful she had the courage to eat the snack he bought at the Taguatinga bus station 6 months ago, because his mom taught him it's wrong to waste food. By late afternoon, he finally returned to the family mansion with his pet wife, but his parents didn't seem thrilled to see their son still accompanied by this individual with more canine traits than human ones. Perhaps for this reason, or so I assume, Margrave wondered how things had sunk to this level. He decided to cry in the shower when the princess decided it was a good idea to try to mate with a bear statue in the garden. After watching his son pull the crazy woman off the statue, the man could only lament the situation with a deep hatred that mere words could never express the true intensity of this overwhelming feeling. Eric, for his part, was speechless at his wife's antics, but since he's a fully formed Buddha and not easily rattled, he remained strong as a bull while his wife, who is definitely a dog, couldn't take her eyes off the bear statue. A maid offered to take care of the mess, but Eric let the blessed women rest from the trip. With giggles aimed at the man, they left the scene after being dismissed. Afterward, Eric informed the butler that Misa is a member of the family, so she should be treated as such when she's not feeling well. Of course, the butler isn't crazy enough to argue with his boss, but Eric's mother, who watched the scene with her villainous face, is likely not 100% on board with her son's statement. Later, during a family meal, Eric asked the maids to leave, as he could feed his wife without help. The maids warned him that the girl goes nuts during meals, so it's always important to have backup. Ignoring that, he asked if she liked anything specific, but they explained that she's worse than a pig and ostrich, eating anything you put in front of her. So Eric cut a piece of meat and gave it to his wife, who chewed slowly for some reason. Knowing the girl was a troglodyte, Eric already braced himself, but couldn't avoid Misa spitting the food right in his face. To make matters worse, she slammed her plate on the table with force, completely losing her cool. While the maids continued giggling behind the Lord's back, he wondered if maybe she didn't like goblin penis meat, the Chladni kitchen specialty. Without getting a satisfactory answer, he asked the maids to prepare to clean the princess, an order they obeyed as promptly as when your dad told you to turn off the TV and go to bed as a kid because church was early the next day. With less patience for the wildling than her son, Eric's parents began plotting something nasty behind the scenes. Their idea was that Misa didn't need to live much longer in this house. Margrave made a hand signal that indicated it would be game over for the princess, but Thaliasa responded with gestures, saying they'd be booted from the server if they dumped the girl in a ditch. Eavesdropping on that muted conversation, Eric realized there was some shady business going on. In the next scene, we are taught about the geopolitics of Esquiller. In this kingdom, there are 3 houses known as the 3 Pillars. The first is House Salazake, with a coat of arms featuring a snake wrapped around a tree. This clan was responsible for laying the foundations of the kingdom. With a badass coat of arms depicting a pampas deer, House Crispin is responsible for the kingdom's internal security. Lastly, boasting a coat of arms with a black bear framed by 2 cross swords, we have House Chladni, in charge of external security. Obviously, these 3 clans had significant influence over the kingdom's military and security. Now, speaking of the land of Esquiller's former sovereign, the late king, known as King of the Ladies or medieval Mr. Catra. He had 3 queens, each from a different family. The first prince was born from the daughter of the Duke of Salazek. Being the eldest, the most conniving character in this work, so far snagged the crown and became the Joffrey Baratheon of the new generation, the cursed king Mer Malik II, the tyrant. Being an irresponsible kid, he basically did whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, neglecting his duties as the sovereign of this no-man's land. Under the guise of maintaining order, Mer Malik wiped out his mother's entire family, House Salazek. As if that weren't enough, the tyrant began persecuting the other 2 most important families in the kingdom, so they decided to unite to withstand the brat's tantrums. Secretly, Houses Chladni and Crispin arranged the marriage of their heirs to maintain their power and spark a rebellion after the war ended. However, as expected, things went south. House Chladni, after gaining great prestige during the kingdom's conflicts, won the people's sympathy, who were fed up with Joffrey Baratheon from Wish's tyranny. The king, for his part, couldn't let that Baratheon, sorry for the pun, since if anyone deserved applause in this mess, it had to be him. This is where we understand why he threw this bomb at House Chladni, and that bomb is called Misa. As Margrave repeats for the 59th time, the cursed girl is so out of her mind, she doesn't even know how to hold a fork. Thalassa argues that the princess was normal as a child, but lost her mind after seeing people murdered before her eyes. Eric comments that this is unfortunate, to which his father shouts, "Who's feeling sorry for whom?" To make matters worse, the man points out that some vassals are suggesting Ambric replace Eric as heir, and even the Marquis Crispin floated this idea to correct the mess the king threw at the Chladnis. In other words, Eric's position as heir is threatened because of Misa Esquiller. As usual, our boy Eric's speech bubble fills with ellipses, proving once again that his unwavering stance is just a facade. He asks if Grand Duke Hagel is still hesitating, and his father replies that the guy is a huge coward. Recalling a fateful event, Margrave wonders if they accidentally took Hagel's upper head along with his lower one. Speaking of the devil, Grand Duke Hagel is the king's cousin and the only living member of the royal family besides the princess. Although she's a crucial figure for legitimizing the rebellion, he suffered an accident, in quotes, leaving him paralyzed and unable to produce heirs. My God, I don't even want to know what happened to this guy's balls because just imagining the pain makes me want to wail in pity for the poor man. To make matters worse, aside from lacking balls, Hagel also has no friends, condemning him to a sad and isolated life. In other words, the concept of luck in this man's life is as non-existent as his testicles. Frustrated, Margrave slams his hand on the table, shouting that nothing goes right in this dump, then runs off to cry in bed where it's warm. His wife complains that her husband has been losing his temper too much these days, while Eric stares at her with increasingly ellipsed speech bubbles. Pretty soon, someone will start writing Braille in those things, and I'm paying to see it. Changing the subject, Thalassa fills another glass of Cantina de Serra wine and asks what her son thinks about uniting the two houses through marriage. He replies that it seemed like a crazy idea at first, but now that he's in the thick of it, it still feels like the beginning. After all, marriage is something that grabs the entire kingdom's attention. It's not something you can simply hide from the king. Still, since there's no heir to the throne, convincing the nobles could take forever, and the Marquis's daughter can't remain single for too long. To that, Thalassa agrees and adds that the war has rotted people's political instincts just like Monarch's brain, given that even a donkey like her son understands what's going on. But that bumbling idiot of her husband still goes on about canceling the princess's CPF. Lastly, since she brought up Misa, the noblewoman acknowledges that it's not advantageous to open themselves up to criticism from the maids. But in one thing, the Falchions were right. Eric shouldn't even think about loving that wild princess. While the young man looks at his mother with a dumbfounded face, she claims that a man's love is superficial, just like her dad's was with her before he left to buy cigarettes and never came back. Thalassa doesn't expect her son to be any different, so she's already informed Mr. Big Oat at the corner store that young Eric will be buying a pack of Marlboro Red when things get tough. As night falls, Eric walks through the mansion's hallways, always accompanied by his ellipsed speech bubble. Depressed, he begins to believe his mother wants to pull his wife's plug, just like his father. As he recalls that beautiful face, those lovely feet, that perfect little hand, and that Fusca engine-like snoring, the young lord gets ticked off at the thought of his beloved being taken away from him. In the midst of his reflections, he's surprised by voices coming from the young lady's room, where those cursed maids were mistreating his beloved, trying to force her to go to bed. Inside, the maids complained that the girl was heavier than a hippo after eating the entire lasagna at dinner, so much so that people were looking at the girl with disgust and contempt for her repugnant behavior, this wild beast that dares to be called a princess. In the next scene, Eric appears in the room, lamenting how hard the maids had worked today. Unfortunately, the ellipsed man heard little of what was said inside, so he didn't know that the witches were screwing with the poor girl. Thus, he asked both of them to leave, which they promptly did, leaving Eric alone with Misa once again. After observing the princess intently, along with his favorite ellipsed speech bubble, he concluded that Misa was in a great mood today, so he decided to sit next to her and ease her into her new life in society. Today's story was that Misa was now at the capital mansion and would henceforth live her life lounging between this place and the region of Cladis. Speaking of lounging, Eric wanted to know if the girl was going through a rough patch at the hands of some scoundrel in this mansion, as she seemed to want to make eye contact when he entered the room, though she quickly lost interest. Either way, he thought it absurd that the princess only wore that ragged dress that looked like something out of The Ring, especially with that Barbie-like face she flaunted around. It just wasn't fair. The girl should be treated like the doll she was, according to the Lord. Speaking of dolls, Eric felt the heat of passion rushing through his veins as he ran his eyes over his wife's beautifully sculpted face, especially when she pressed her lips together and spat a nice gob of saliva in the man's face. Even so, this wasn't the time to indulge in bizarre fetishes, but rather to teach his wife how to behave in public. So he explained that it wasn't cool to spit on people without their permission. With that said, he asked Misa to sleep because, after what had happened, he needed to quickly resolve a tense 5-against-1 situation that would soon unfold in the bathroom at full throttle. So he got up and asked his wife not to call him if anything happened, leaving his speech bubble with Misa, so he wouldn't have to witness the atrocity that would happen to the shower drain. Half an hour later, our hero returned to the bedroom and rested beside his wife in bed. The strong wind blowing against the window gave the impression that something nasty would happen at any moment. And this feeling was reinforced when a lightning bolt struck near the bedroom balcony. Now that we've panned the camera down to the bottom of the panel, you might have been spooked by the fact that Misa had her eyes eerily wide open next to Eric, which I must confess happened to me while writing this script at 11 p.m. in my dark bedroom. When morning came, our protagonist was still alive, as we can see. So, let's move on with the plot. Trying to spoon-feed his beloved some soup, he asked if she had slept well, as switching from a king-size premium plus bed to a king-size presidential V might have given her a backache. Shoving a dry bread roll down her throat without a second thought, Misa still hadn't uttered a single word, only emitting animalistic grunts. At that moment, Rick activated his ellipsed speech bubble to indicate that the clown's brain was working, and he concluded that the girl's appearance had worsened. She looked more roughed up than she did before. Moving on from that, he advised Misa that it was good to eat to stay strong, even if she wasn't hungry. However, the girl plunged her hand into the soup without mercy, making a big splash for the poor guy who would have to clean up the mess. As if that wasn't enough, she pulled her hand out of the food and shoved it into her mouth. Truly a deplorable scene. The man watched the tragedy unfold, accompanied by 5 ellipses. Without a doubt, the arrival of the princess had turned House Chladni's life upside down. After her marriage to Eric, the atmosphere in the territory had changed, though not very visibly. While his men trained intensely, Captain Eric Chladni arrived at the training ground, flaunting his tight black shirt to make a statement. The men welcomed the officer and tried to keep the vibe the same, but in reality, the awkward tension was palpable in the air, and it was clear that everyone had something to say about the boss's wife. Eric barked at the group, ordering them to get back to training, and the soldiers clammed up, returning to their work. But the training ground wasn't the only place things were getting ugly. Margrave Chladni himself had started avoiding family meals because of Misa, as he could no longer stand her antics at the dinner table. This caused Thaliesa to start complaining about her husband's behavior, as the man was losing his cool at every meal. This affected the mood of all the vassals of House Chladni, who became confused by this unusual phase of their overlords. Nevertheless, of course, no one dared speak up in front of Eric for fear of being sliced across the mouth for free. Despite the awful atmosphere taking hold, Eric always maintained his firm and calm demeanor, causing people to question whether the captain was a strong man or just a fool who had no idea what was going on. After returning from his intense training session without moving a muscle, Eric wiped his sweat with a towel and asked the butler where his wife was. The butler reported that she'd been wandering around the house, but now she was in the maid's workroom. Outraged, the Lord demanded to know what those women wanted with his wife. In the maid's room, they watched Misa sleep as if she were a work of art or an animal in a cage, depending on the point of view. One of them commented that the girl preferred to sleep in that corner because of the smell of farts and dirty laundry, which made her fall into a deep sleep as the aroma weakened her vital signs. Another maid was simpler and bet that the princess liked the softness of the piled-up clothes. A third maid suggested it could be a problem for them to let her sleep wrapped in the servants' clothes, as the scent of common folk might anger Margrave. Lastly, another maid remarked that the lady's hair was beautiful and shiny, like strands of silver, and a colleague remembered once seeing a white kitten just like that. At that moment, Eric entered, asking about the 2 royal maids, that troublesome duo, as the 2 women responsible for Misa were nowhere to be found. The other maids admitted they didn't know where they had gone, but Thaliesa had been informed that the princess was there, and since Misa had chosen to sleep on the cold, hard floor of the workroom, they had placed their clothes to warm and soften it like a bed. With that, Eric instructed them to return to their tasks and picked up his wife. After climbing the stairs with the wild girl and walking through the mansion's halls, the Lord Captain arrived at their enormous bedroom, only to be surprised when Misa suddenly opened her eyes in shock. She let out a few grunts and struggled in the man's arms. So Eric hurried to lay her on the bed before the luggage fell and fractured a rib for no reason. With that done, she stood on all fours on the bed in a canine attack position, which the young officer responded to by processing in his limited mind what this animalistic behavior could mean. To be honest with himself, after observing the woman for these past few days, he had concluded that Misa didn't particularly like him. For some reason, Eric felt that Misa saw him only as a means of transportation, perhaps a pack mule or a free bus. Noticing a stray hair on the girl's head, the young man tried to remove it, but his brilliant mind couldn't foresee that the frightened beast would behave like a frightened beast, desperately fleeing from his hands. He tried to calm Misa and explained that he had no intention of hurting her, only wanting to yank the hair from her scalp. Then, taking advantage of the fact that his deep, soothing voice had relaxed the wildling, he removed the strand and wondered if the poor girl had really freaked out over something so trivial. Suddenly, Misa Esquiller looked directly at the man, who reacted as we know by now. If you have no idea how he reacted at this point in the story, here's a hint. He didn't say a single word. Anyway, inside the girl's deranged mind, she remembered the maid's words about a beautiful white kitten she had once seen. That's when Misa realized she might have found her own white kitten. With the nightfall over House Cladney, Misa let out terrible, deafening roars while sleeping soundly, as her husband sat in the office with a document in hand. The paper read, Malika Adil. These were the names of the princess's 2 personal maids. According to the record, the 2 troublemakers always abandoned Misa, leaving her in the hands of the other staff, and always making themselves scarce at the first opportunity. Apparently, the diabolical duo had some sort of scheme up their sleeves. But that wasn't the only problem. For example, aside from that, there was also the fact that the food supply for the territory's residents was a complete disaster. Everything happening at House Cladney was drama, and more drama. Nothing else. But it didn't stop there. Another issue had been keeping the Lord awake on this starry night. Upon opening a letter in an envelope, Eric read a news report addressed to the young master. According to the young master's instructions, someone had been tasked with tracking the targets, and it was discovered they had another meeting at that house on the outskirts last night. Yes, that girl from the tavern was having a fling with the young master, none other than Lord Margrave Cladney. Analyzing the situation, Eric tells us that when his father suddenly started discussing a marriage with the Crispin family, he was the only one who suspected something was off. Thinking to himself, the young man finds it makes sense in his mind, because even though Margrave's proposal wasn't particularly bad for the knights and nobles to hear, the young man couldn't shake a certain discomfort. That's why he began secretly spying on his father in a very secretive way. One day, hiding only half of his body behind a tree, Eric couldn't believe what he was seeing. A girl from the tavern was sneaking into his lord's quarters. This was the first time Eric realized that his mother had been cheated on, and let's just say he wasn't too happy about it. On top of that, considering the war they were living through, where life and death were at stake, the poor guy wasn't in the mood to play games with this scandalous gossip. After this discovery, Eric sought out some humiliation, trying to find out if this woman had reasons to give her body to that man. After all, he saw the old man farting and burping every day at the dinner table, so he didn't believe the young lady was just interested in the man's simple charms or physical assets. Even though Margrave was a well-preserved old man, there could be some conspiracy afoot. Maybe the woman was working on a plot to kidnap the rich man or something, but nothing was discovered. So, Eric decided to leave the matter alone. However, when the war ended, the old man had the audacity to drag this tavern wench into the kingdom. But the drama didn't stop there. Margrave's right-hand man, Sir Kelbaning, stole the lord's mistress and made her his wife. So, let's say that this right hand had a serious case of arthritis. Well, having said that, Eric had no choice but to snitch everything to his mother through a letter, providing all the evidence that the itch on her head wasn't lice. The reply he received from the gossiping maid, Edel, was, "My lady is too tired to bother with such matters." According to the lady, she was as old as a shriveled mango and could no longer satisfy the stallion's needs, so she didn't care if her husband was fooling around with other skirts. To tell the truth, she even thought it was a good thing not to have to look at that greasy beard, as it allowed her to stay in her room watching Grey's Anatomy without being disturbed. The maid pointed out that it would have been easier to cause an uproar if Margrave's mistress had been a noble woman, but since she had no connection with other people of royalty or nobility, known to be the most gossip-prone social circle, it was hard for this news to gain traction. According to Edel, besides Kelbaning's occasional visits to the woman's house, no one else was seen going after that young lady who liked to share a body. So, Eric leaned back in his chair and realized there was nothing new under the sun for now. In other words, no updates on this scandal. In any case, even though it was a classic reaction of a mellow cuckold, the young man wasn't surprised by his mother's attitude in this case. From the beginning, she and his father didn't get along very well in raising the family, so there probably wasn't much deep affection between them. In the middle of this reflection, Eric heard his beloved wife suddenly wake up and rub her left eye with her paw to get rid of the crust that had accumulated. "Are you awake?" asked the Lord. "Since the maiden can't communicate, I'll answer for her. Yes, Misa is awake." But Eric wasn't satisfied and kept asking more questions, wondering why the woman didn't go back to sleep so he could return to his political plots. However, the wild woman continued walking towards her husband, limping strangely. Suddenly, she gently grabbed the handsome man's shoulder and sat on his lap without saying what she wanted. Eric looked at her in confusion, with a bead of sweat forming on his left cheek, while she groaned like a zombie and rummaged through his documents and evidence of conspiracies, searching for toilet paper. Eric thought she was curious about the drama, so he pulled out one of the papers for her to take a closer look at. Considering that Misa had never paid much direct attention to the night before, now he was actually a bit happy to get some attention. As Misa tore up this month's blacksmith bill, Eric reflected that, due to the daily rush and his obsession with finding out why his father was fooling around with a tavern waitress, he had somewhat neglected a very emotional feeling. For a moment, the young man felt he would spend the rest of his life with this woman. Taking advantage of this cute moment, Eric remembered when he became a knight during his childhood, and this proud responsibility filled Eric with a sense of pride and duty. However, it wasn't long before he woke up from this fantasy dream to face the cruel and boring reality. After all, even though it was such a beautiful and splendid moment, it was just a little theater, a mere blood oath to the family, nothing more than a corny spectacle of noble pride, like that meme of Obama putting a medal on himself. That's why he didn't care who his wife would be in the future. All he thought about were sweaty men on the battlefield with their giant swords. For that reason, when he was given a Labrador in a dress as a woman, he didn't mind all that much. Fulfilling his responsibilities as the heir to the family was the priority. Everything else was secondary. If he got a goat in makeup on his wedding night, it would be a bonus, it would be fair game. The problem arose when Misa tried to grab an important document, so the young man had to stop her before things went south and pulled the thing up high so the poor thing couldn't reach it. From the very well-drawn crest on the paper, though I don't know what document this is, I assume it's indeed important, and since Eric hasn't even finished reading it yet, it would be better if it wasn't torn to pieces. Misa kept groaning incessantly, trying to grab the thing at all costs. And since Eric couldn't get the woman off his lap, the two spent exactly 4 hours and 32 minutes wrestling to see who would keep the paper until day finally broke over the house of Cladney. Thaliasa was informed by a maid that March was just around the corner, so it might be a good idea to have a large bonfire prepared separately in the greenhouse for this year's recital. The young lady replied that a bonfire would be nice since it was colder compared to previous years. Amid this boring conversation about bonfires, a shout rang out through the hall like a stray arrow. "Princess, please don't run." When she saw Misa charging towards her, with her personal maid Deal trailing behind, Thaliasa let out a deep sigh, because here came some nonsense. Since Misa had spent the night trying to wrestle that paper from Eric's hand, she collapsed backward like a sack of potatoes, hit her head on the floor, and passed out. Thaliasa remarked that this was unusual since the princess was usually always with her maids. But for some reason, she had come to her today, even though Thaliasa didn't have a bone in her hand. The maid found it odd that Thaliasa was calling the woman princess. After all, she wasn't a stranger and should be addressed by her name. At least, that would be normal, but the noblewoman had no idea what to call the girl, as she couldn't remember her name and thought it would be a mistake to call her Leslie, as Eric might get mad. But since that's the case, she asked Deal what she should call her, and not even the wretched maid knew the poor woman's name. The more important maid reminded them that, 3 generations ago, the head of the Edvard family and his wife used to call the girl by name. With that said, as if by magic, Thaliasa suddenly remembered that the blessed girl's name was Misa, so she repeated the princess's title to see her reaction. Upon hearing her name, Misa looked directly at the crown and sat on her bum, surprising everyone present. Then she flashed a wide smile, as if approving of the gesture. Or at least that's how I interpreted it, as I have no idea if she understands anything that's being said. Just like me, Thalassa was confused, so she waited for something to happen with a cute expression on her face, but at least she presumed she could now call Misa by name. In fact, she admitted it was a pretty name, especially since she had looked it up on Google a few days ago, and found out it means meat in Latvian. Either way, feeling quite cheeky, Deal took advantage of the fact that her mistress had bonded with the animal and asked the old lady to take care of the princess until dinner time, so she could spend a few hours doing absolutely nothing and enjoying some time off, something she hadn't had in 7 years, or since she signed the work contract in this pigsty. After the maid left, another servant took the opportunity to burn the ears of the aforementioned lady, accusing Deal of neglecting her duties in relation to the princess, even though her only task was to take care of her. As if that wasn't enough, Misa's other personal maid, Malika, is never even seen at the mansion. The girl shirks work with ease and doesn't even feel ashamed about it. Hearing this with a villainous expression, Thalassa assumed there was a reason why the two were so lazy with their duties. Regardless of what that reason might be, Thalassa was tied up and would have to play their game, as she didn't know what they were trying to accuse her of, and that was her biggest concern. This worry struck her with a massive headache the moment she thought about it, which is why the young lady requested a painkiller cocktail mixed with skin powder moisturizer from Edel. In turn, the maid went to fetch it from her mistress's room. Without delay, she took from another servant the medication that, according to what was said by the same, was the one the boss always takes, which was next to her bed. With that done, Edel praised her colleague's work and approached Thalassa once again to pass the headache bomb cocktail to the poor woman. But before handing the medicine to the lady, Edel put the tray aside to admire the fact that her mistress was allowing Misa on her lap, something that was not very common, to say the least, so she asked if her lady was in her right mind. As expected, Thalassa was going through a rough patch, so she ordered the doctor to be called immediately. Changing the subject, the lady inquired if this animalistic princess was 20 years old, which Edel confirmed. With that said, she shared with the servant the not-so-pretty background of the princess. According to what she'd heard, Misa saw more than half of the royal family turning into meat soup in front of her when she was still very young, which is why the poor thing ended up so crazy. And since life couldn't stop surprising us with cruelty, the cursed one continued to be exploited until her rear end gave out, which is why she was still in this deplorable condition today. In a burst of empathy I didn't expect to see, Thalassa felt sorry for the girl with that Annie-like tone everyone is familiar with. So beautiful and going through so much. May God bless her. The lady emphasized the beauty of the girl's eyes and the shape of her face, so she concluded that all she needed was to feed the dog well for her skin to glow. Confused, Edel hadn't imagined seeing her boss being so kind, until she suffered a sinister glare from Misa, who was glaring at the maid with those shiny eyes that looked like marbles. Thinking about it, Thalassa realized this color seemed familiar to her in some way, and this conclusion was quite surprising in her head. After all, those eyes resembled those of Lady perhaps. Anyway, putting that matter aside, Thalassa decided that Misa needed a full salon bath, starting with doing her nails, which looked like claws, and brushing that disheveled mane. With eyes and ears very attentive to this conversation, Edel noticed that her mistress was remembering that child when she looked at the princess. Later, without much delay, Eric was informed that his favorite maid, Edel, had spent the entire morning with his mother. With this news in mind, the young man strolled through the majestic halls of his mansion. Meanwhile, Edel volunteered to take care of the wild woman's nails, but Thalassa took charge and handled that part without hesitation, proving she wasn't one of those useless nobles who left everything in the hands of others. According to her, the dog might bite if any unfamiliar hand tried to touch it. Suddenly, Eric entered the room with the classic surprised Pikachu face, not understanding what the hell was going on. Afraid his mother might be torturing his wife, he asked what the hell was happening, but Thalassa calmly explained that she was trying to give this car a makeover so it could fly back to the Lord's bedroom, because the vehicle needed a renovation, and it was hard for it to run on the road with those unregulated tires. In Eric's mind, this seemed like madness. His own mother wanting to cut Misa's nails, and even touching her feet, which had such a powerful smell that a mere whiff nearby could lead to a fatal death. But that wasn't even the worst part. This which he had to call his mother had a mossy stone where her heart should be, as empathy was something that had always been far from her pig-like soul. For these reasons and others, the young lord was certain that the noblewoman would never lower herself to endure Misa's stench for no reason. Since he could remember, Eric had to live with a cold and calculating woman who only cared about acting like a person devoid of feelings. Even if it was with her own son, a little boy who should have received all the love and care from mommy. Thinking to himself, Eric could hardly believe this vile creature was suddenly all over his wife. It didn't seem like the same person. As far as he could recall, Thalassa only acted this way with one person in the whole world, Rosie, her youngest sister, when the dear little one was still alive in this cruel, God-forsaken world. Well, one way or another, it's worth standing up and praising the Lord because there's a possibility, however remote, that his mother might come to like his wife simply because she resembles her sister in some way, or at least reminds her of little Rosie. Anyway, after this brief reflection, Eric asked for the scissors to cut his wife's nails. Thalassa took charge, saying he could leave it to her. But the young man insisted on doing the job himself because he was extremely worried about the possibility of his mother acting the same way she did on Rosie's last day. So, with scissors in hand, Eric surprised everyone and proved that he could do the job, which I find hard to believe any medieval nobleman knew how to do. But since we're talking about a fantasy world, maybe feminists were in power and taught the poor guy to learn normal people's skills, whether he liked it or not. Noticing that her husband was cutting her nails, Misa imitated him by expressing herself with a speech bubble full of ellipses. In Eric's mind, this was the very manifestation of emotional stability. So he deduced that the kitty was as calm as a gorilla. With that in mind, and with visibly dry lips, Misa repeated the ellipses with even more determination. However, even though she seemed fine, the princess started acting uncomfortably, drawing Edel's attention to this fact. According to the maid, the animal didn't look well, so she assumed it was hunger and requested a moment before pushing a cookie from the tray into the poor girl's mouth. With that done, Misa displayed a genuine look of confusion at the unexpected act, creating a deathly silence in the room. Eric asked if the maid had poop for brains for doing something like that out of nowhere, but she played dumb, saying the princess seemed uncomfortable, so she thought it would be a great idea to shove food down her throat without warning. After all, the last time she acted weird, Edel had shoved a sweet into her mouth, and it immediately calmed the beast. Apparently, Misa was a fan of treats. Since that's the case, Eric accepted that his wife was being treated like an animal again, right in front of him. I'm not a psychologist and wouldn't want to overstep any boundaries here, but I think it'd be a good idea for the people in this house to start treating Misa like a human, because encouraging this kind of animalistic behavior in the poor girl seems like a recipe for disaster to me, as it might keep the princess stuck in this pitiful behavior, or even worse, regress her psychological state to even more troubling levels. Anyway, before anyone accuses me of speaking about things I don't know, which I do with pride, let's get back to the story. Noticing the young girl, Thalassa remarked that she was eating with a scrunched-up mouth and concluded it was good to see her eating so well. With that said, we can see that a speech bubble with Eric's ellipses got lost in the comic limbo, probably preparing to appear at some point when he wouldn't know how to express himself verbally later on in the plot. When night fell in this beautiful luxury dump, Eric couldn't quite grasp the situation he was in, trying to undo the damage the maids had done with his wife. The Lord sought to educate her in a way that would help her act like a normal human being, instructing her to chew slowly so she wouldn't swallow food prematurely. Amid these lessons, he reflected on why his mother had suddenly started treating his wife as if she were her sister. Sherlock Holmes's first guess was the most accurate. The blue eyes, just like Rosie's. The thing is, Eric's cousin Amberic's eyes also resembled hers. Yet Thalassa wasn't seen smashing Misa's head with a closed fist for no reason, like she did with that wretch. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, Eric simply couldn't understand. Anyway, at that moment, a butler arrived with the grilled quail that had taken forever to cook and placed it on the table, as ordered by the master. Thinking it over, Eric concluded that the princess seemed to have become relatively docile after eating by herself, so she probably wouldn't play badminton with this quail. However, a strange reaction from Misa suddenly caught his attention. Somehow, it seemed like the woman was suffering in her own way, and Eric assumed it had something to do with the damn quail served on the table, so he asked if he should get rid of the bird. As far as he remembered, the maids had said the young lady ate like a pig, because no matter what was thrown on the table, she'd eat it. She could even eat a human if given the chance. Anyway, he got rid of the roasted quail and refocused on the princess, along with the speech bubble full of ellipses that had been left behind in the comic limbo. Apparently, the girl had some trauma with quails. Life comes, life goes, the pain passes, and so do the days. After this beautiful piece of poetry, we can deduce that time passed. And as usual, Misa was causing a scene somewhere in the mansion. This time, she was once again bothering the maids in the little room they used to catch up on gossip. Poor things, there's no room for anything else in this house. Being a working-class citizen here is a tough life. Since the nuisance was lying on the floor, the girls had to find a way to keep Misa from getting cold, given that she was innocently playing with a ball of yarn and had no intention of moving anytime soon. One of the maids rolled the princess onto some blankets laid on the floor and tried to communicate with her to see if there was anything else she could do to make her more comfortable. Nearby, other girls commented that the co-worker might as well be talking to herself, as everyone in this dump knew that Lady Misa wasn't capable of understanding a single word spoken to her. Another maid argued that Eric always talked to her anyway, even if Misa didn't understand, and another pointed out that the lad loved his wife so much that he acted as her pack mule in every possible situation, never letting her put her feet on the ground because he was so in love with this animal disguised as a noblewoman. The gossip flew fast and furious in the little room, so one of them mentioned that Lord Eric didn't even seem interested in women. According to her, what the man wanted was still soft. A coworker retorted that it was just the gentleman's way of showing affection and that there was nothing wrong with that. I agree. That was way out of line from the accuser. Another maid pointed out that the walls have ears, so the homophobe should be more careful about what she says, unless she wanted to be fired for cause. The gossip continued at full speed. Keep fishing with me. Another maid suggested the princess should wear better clothes, because this poorly cut tarp she wore as an outfit was a joke, especially since the poor thing was always rolling around on the floor and getting her clothes dirty all the time. Her coworker added that since that was the case, it would be easier to make a bib for the baby princess with a beautiful embroidered design, maybe with yellow flowers, the Chladni family crest, the Volta Redonda shield, Jair Bolsonaro holding a fish, an AK-47, or perhaps the tiger from the Tiger game. As the girls debated the best way to represent Lady Misa with her new bib, a noise caught their attention. Outside the mansion, as always, Eric pretended to be doing something among the soldiers in training, wearing his beautiful tight black shirt, waiting for time to pass so it could finally be mealtime. Needing an excuse to dig into lunch, he looked up at the sky, assessed the position of the sun and clouds, and the speed and direction of the wind, then declared it was noon. By the way, thinking about it, he wondered if his wife had eaten well, because from what happened that morning with that disgusting vomit she spewed all over the table, it seemed likely that it wasn't a very pleasant meal. Well, thinking with my own brain, if the guy had ordered an entire quail for the poor woman for breakfast, imagine what they served her for lunch. Sometimes it's not even her fault. This house doesn't have yogurt and oatmeal for a lighter breakfast. Anyway, Eric thanked God and finished yet another training session where he didn't seem to do anything at all, then headed for the feast, because that was the best part of the day. Upon entering the mansion, the Lord was told that Misa had bathed in the garden stream and was now napping in the maid's quarters after lunch. Eric didn't seem to like the part about the stream, so the servant corrected himself, saying that, in fact, the young lady was on her way to the chapel with Thaliesa when she got distracted by the little fish and accidentally fell into the water. With that said, Eric didn't understand how his wife could be running that risk, especially since she was with the lady of the house's owner. In any case, the young lord understood that his girl had fun all day and was now getting her nap in, so that was fine. The butler commented that Lady Misa hadn't enjoyed the chapel very much, but Eric had already imagined this nonsense, because the poor thing would have had to sit still for a long time without understanding a single thing that was going on. According to the servant, Misa had been obedient with Lady Thaliesa at first, but when they reached the chapel, she started grumbling like the devil fleeing the cross. For that reason, they had to tie the poor thing up outside with the maids who were also not worthy of the Lord's grace. Upon hearing this, Eric wondered if Misa would have enjoyed it more if she had been given a treat instead of being forced to sing Roberto Carlos's version of Nossa Senhora, Give Me Your Hand, or at least if some kind soul had thrown a stick for her to fetch. With this in mind, the heir ordered the butler to leave treats on every table every day, as if this pigsty were a classic grandmother's house. The next day, upon reuniting with the love of his life at mealtime, this time mooing like a cow, Eric managed to feed her more peacefully and effectively than before, which was a real relief for the poor man, who struggled so much to get the woman to eat properly. By the looks of it, today Misa was in a good mood and had a pleasant expression, unlike yesterday when she seemed constipated to the point of making her meal impossible. Anyway, since the young lady was only eating meat, the man tried to teach her to include vegetables in her diet. With that in mind, he separated 2 types of questionable food to give his wife, and she even opened her mouth to receive the airplane spoon, but part of the bite fell onto her chest. Eric prepared to repeat the process, but not without first removing the food that had landed on the girl's chest. Very carefully, he approached his hand to this part of Misa's body, with his speech bubble full of ellipses already ahead of him on this journey, almost putting his face where it shouldn't be. Embarrassed, Eric asked for a second to control the blood flow to the lower head, then carefully removed the little morsel as if he were performing lung cancer surgery. Misa tried to eat the fallen food, but the man mistakenly tried to teach her not to eat food that had fallen on their clothes, which I personally think is utter nonsense. Agreeing with me, Misa stood up for her convictions and grabbed the dictator's wrist, then bit down on both the food and his finger. However, in the end, it wasn't such a big bite. The little creature managed to adjust the strength of her bite with remarkable talent, giving a slight impression that the atmosphere was heating up. Still unsure if he liked this new direction, Eric pulled his hand from the spoiled woman's mouth with all his might, and the woman just stared back at him with a dumbfounded expression, and only God knew what was going on inside that troubled head. With her beautiful eyes that resembled the darkness and beauty of the deepest and most polluted ocean, Misa put on her usual show by grabbing the tablecloth and yanking it with all her might, sending everything flying and making a mess on the floor. Witnessing this tragedy, all Edel could do was cry inside, as she was once again subjected to humiliation in this house, because everyone knew it wouldn't be Misa cleaning up this mess, let alone Eric. As she gathered the wild woman, the maid pondered how exhausting it was to be a servant to an adult baby who acted out all the time. After the embarrassment passed, we were left with Eric's neck, followed by his mother resting on his lap. Furious, the condemned young man paused for a moment to make a reflection I can't reproduce verbally. Yeah, buddy, it's not easy for anyone. When night came with its usual glow, the weirdest couple in the kingdom shared their king-size bed, where Eric, as always, hogged all the blankets from his poor wife. Crying his eyes out, he pondered how confused they both felt when Misa had bitten his finger in that delicious way, to the point that he could still feel the warmth at the tip of his finger even now. As much as she was his wife, Misa seemed like a child, and maybe she didn't even know Eric was her husband. According to the knight, the princess was by no means a conscious being capable of reason. All that just to call the poor girl stupid, so many beautiful words wasted. Anyway, Eric lamented the pitiful situation he was in, while covering his face and suffering internally from the gravity of the problem. After another sleepless night in this dump, Eric sat in one of the 34 rooms of the mansion with a cup of coffee in hand, while listening to Edel say that there was a recital this Wednesday. Thaliesa was worried that Misa would get scared by the crowd, but Eric thought his mother was overplaying her sudden motherly role with the princess. In response, she argued that the hyenas would be out for blood at this banquet, so she had to assert herself as the matriarch of the game. With this accurate metaphor about the ways of the nobility, Thaliesa was an old fox and knew full well how these people behaved at large events like this. In the case of the recital, it happened once a month and gathered the largest concentration of gossips per square meter in the entire kingdom, where vipers exchanged opinions about the most sinister scandals in high society. Of course, it was the best opportunity to find out everything that was going on out there. This event was hosted by the Chladni family, or rather, anyone other than this family, because the ones who did all the work were the peasants running back and forth around the house like, shockingly, peasants setting up every structure needed for this party. Apparently, the Marquis of Crispin's wife and his only daughter, Lacane, had confirmed on Instagram that they'd be attending the little party. Considering this would be the first meeting since the two families had broken off the engagement, you can bet this confrontation would be intense, because as it was a secret matter that couldn't be discussed, no one would dare stick their nose in that conversation. So all we'd have was the intense tension of a brewing fight hanging in the air like a bad smell. Thaliesa invited Misa to see how the greenhouse was coming along for the party, but unsurprisingly, the woman didn't respond. She just kept eating sweets one after another. Eric interrupted his mother's plans and asked if his wife had played enough today, but let's just say Lady Misa didn't respond. Thaliesa teased the young man, saying he seemed more like the girl's father than her husband, while confirming that she had played a lot and there was no need to worry. Anyone with Thaliesa was with God, and God was quite the prankster. But since her son was just hanging around, the mother asked him to join them at the greenhouse, but the man corrected her, saying he was actually quite busy with a tough boss in Elden Ring and had just stepped out to fart outside the room and see how the ladies were doing. After accidentally confessing to his wife that the strange smell in their room wasn't from the dead skunk he kept as a pet in one of his drawers, the man with ellipses in his speech bubble let a drop of sweat fall, while Thaliesa set off to her destination with her new pet daughter. Without delay, after walking 15 kilometers inside her own territory, The woman reached the greenhouse with the princess, who was dressed in her usual rags, with her feet clean despite always walking barefoot, which was absolutely absurd. The workers couldn't help but notice that beautiful, eccentric figure, because not only was she beautiful, but she acted like a child or an animal, which wasn't common in these parts. Some servants called out to their lady to show her some detail of the setup, while the princess was left alone to explore the surroundings with a childish fascination in her eyes, or maybe just the bewilderment of someone who had no idea what she was doing. Even so, Eric was relieved to see Misa walking around in public, as before she would have thrown a fit being around so many people. But so far, the little beast was cool and not causing any trouble. Bringing a bird in a cage, two maids approached the young noblewoman with smiles, asking if she had come to see the greenhouse and why she hadn't come to visit them in the studio earlier. According to the two, they would always be waiting for the young lady, while the bird watched the princess with a look that suggested she owed him $20. Returning the bird's gaze, Misa was overtaken by a bizarre feeling, represented by black birds surrounding her field of vision and obscuring everything around her. Suddenly, the bird in the cage commented that her mother had done something wrong, and no matter how bad her mother was, she would always scold Misa for any little thing she did wrong. With that, the bird concluded that her mother was probably silenced, while opening its beak in a macabre way that took the girl by surprise. As expected, Misa had a massive breakdown from this hellish vision and collapsed to the ground with a loud thud. The two maids grew worried about their mistress's condition, and with this reaction, she began to draw the attention of everyone around her, as usual. Deal and Malika, of course, couldn't help but watch the situation out of the corner of their eyes, doing their best not to show even more disgust. Not that it wasn't already obvious how much disdain the two had for that wild woman. Realizing the commotion, Thalliasa didn't react immediately, unlike Eric, the only one who rushed toward the pale girl to help her. He asked the maids what had happened, and they explained that Misa had suddenly started screaming. At that moment, Misa clung to the young man tightly, prompting a question mark after Eric's ellipses bubble. Trembling like a leaf, Misa sought comfort in her man, while one of the maids speculated that the princess had been frightened by the bird in the cage. Malika appeared to comment that the princess was afraid of birds, as everyone could see, but the truth was that it wasn't just this specific fear. Misa had a rather peculiar behavior. With that said, Thalliasa questioned why the witch hadn't mentioned this little detail earlier, while Edel wondered why the maid hadn't given them a heads up. Malika responded with a look of disgust, saying she washed and changed the princess's clothes every single day, so the two women shouldn't be so rude to a simple worker just because she hadn't mentioned such a silly and irrelevant matter. Hearing this, Edel softened a bit, but Thalliasa narrowed her eyes and looked like she was ready to jump and beat that witch to a pulp. She glanced at her son, who was being hugged by Misa, who was crying while making strange noises. Shifting the subject quickly, I'm doing my best not to comment on Lord Eric's ellipses speech bubbles, but I must admit it's hard for me. Anyway, he volunteered to take the girl away to calm her down, then carried her in his arms and looked at her face with all his misplaced empathy and his trusty companion, the speech bubble with ellipses. The poor thing was completely overwhelmed, so Eric assumed it had something to do with the fact that she hadn't eaten the quail that day. For that reason, he decreed that there would be no more birds in this house from now on. If any soldier saw a bird in this house, they should immediately execute the animal in cold blood and throw everything into a garbage bin to burn in the neighbor's yard. Misa made a gesture with her hand, indicating she wanted to go to the garden, though the air warned that there were several birds there, her worst nightmare. Amidst this, Eric wondered if Misa had felt too confined inside the mansion, so he decided to take her away from this repulsive bird-infested den. Thinking back, he realized his wife had spent all her days inside the mansion, until his mother had taken her to the chapel. With that said, instead of carrying the mess back inside right away, he took Misa to a nearby bench, where no birds were likely to appear. At least, that's what it seemed. Even if any of those critters showed up, he was sure he'd kill the poor thing without mercy in the blink of an eye. And if Misa fell asleep, he'd carry her to their bedroom. Whether she heard these words or not, as we don't know if the condemned woman was deaf, Misa gazed at that chiseled jawline and grew weaker under his gaze until she closed her eyes and passed out. During this moment of sleep, with the leaves rustling in the garden, a man approached the couple and commented that they looked great together. His appearance was eerily similar to Eric's, and his friendly demeanor suggested the two knew each other. As he approaches the couple, the man asks if the young man's wife is married, and then if she is asleep. Along with his ellipsis balloon, Eric tells the guy to buzz off, But the intruder reacts hostilely out of nowhere, calling the Lord an idiot and asking if he's afraid his wife will wake up. As if that wasn't enough, after pulling a snot rocket out of his nose, he comments that the couple is the talk of the town, so much so that rumors have reached his house, which makes Eric wonder who the hell has been spreading gossip about him and his beautiful wife. Considering that his uncle is spreading collateral family members to raise his son Ambric as the head of the family, it's clear that the rumors about the matriarch's family can't be ignored. However, Ambric has no interest in being the head of the family, as he is a naturally gentle and lazy person who would love to spend the rest of his life sitting in the garden, watching birds and leaves while inhaling toxic substances. At other times, both he and Eric shared battlefields and developed a very deep connection after exchanging words that could have been their last, to the point that Ambric started supporting Eric more than his own biological uncle. By the way, the man gives some information about who might have spread the gossip, in a case involving a red-headed maid from the capital named Bina, for which Eric thanks him. However, Ambric responds that he should be the one thanking him, as the last few days have been quite fun. Speaking of which, he wants to know where Eric's love for his wife is heading, as the Lord is even trimming the young lady's nails. Eric replies that he couldn't watch his mother do it all clumsily and just stand by. Not only that, Ambric points out that the guy is losing his grip a bit with this wild relationship, as a rumor mill is saying that the big guy is serving as a mule to carry the young woman and won't even let her set foot on the ground, to the point where the poor girl's legs will rot. Eric argues that Misa is still learning to walk like a human, so she needs all the support she can get, and it's much better to carry her in his arms than drag her across the floor. Even so, Ambric doesn't understand why his cousin keeps acting like a lovebird with the girl, because it's fine to pretend to accept the king's gift in good faith. But now the guy is far away, and Eric doesn't need to play the husband anymore, and could well push this woman aside. Upon hearing this, Eric tells the loudmouth to shut up, but the jerk continues, saying that in the name of common sense, they should get rid of this savage, especially since Eric was about to marry Lacane Crispin. For his part, the young heir explains that in terms of analogy, he is holding the dog's leash while the owner goes to the bakery. In other words, the king is going to leave the house of Chladni alone for now. For the moment, that's what matters most, so the decision was the right one. Ambric keeps insulting the poor girl for no reason. So Eric ignores his partner's childish behavior and points out that Misa was treated horribly in the past, although it's unclear exactly what made her go so crazy. In the end, Ambric points out that this woman has been treated like a plague, and that word, plague, leaves his friend pensive for a moment. A few days had passed since the poetry reading began, and all the sycophants of the Chladni family gathered in the greenhouse for a fancy and formal celebration, as always. Even the Crispin mother and daughter showed up, and after everyone sat down, Eric and Misa appeared and exchanged brief greetings with the group. The problem was that people were looking at that exotic couple as if they were devouring them with their eyes, like those gossipy ants who watch the neighborhood from their porch. Also, of course, there was tension between the Chladnis and the Crispins, because Eric ended up marrying Misa. Being the target of all those nasty stares, Eric senses the bad vibe and says he's getting out of there because the atmosphere is too tense. So he takes off with Misa in his arms, leaving young Crispin empty-handed once again. However, she wouldn't let it go so easily, so she went after the scoundrel to confront him. First of all, Eric asks if it's dangerous for a damsel to walk alone in the woods, as the big bad wolf could appear at any moment. Well, wouldn't you know it, a sneaky woman was eavesdropping on their conversation? Go figure. Anyway, without any mincing of words, Lacane Crispin advises young Eric not to have children. And this statement even catches our hero's ellipsis balloon by surprise, as he wonders who this broad thinks she is. After dropping the bombshell, the young lady simply says she's leaving and leaves the poor guy with a flood of spontaneous questions. Returning to her mother, the Crispin daughter mentions that she spoke about the issue of children, while the mother spewed envy by commenting that it was disgusting to see the couple hugging naked earlier in the greenhouse. At least the old lady thinks Lacane is the kind of woman boys will like, because she has a pretty face, knows how to laugh, and has a suspicious TV subscription that gets all the streaming services. Moreover, Crispin's mother points out that her daughter should try to stay in that house, as only then would the two of them receive the affection they had never had before. Must be the house of a gigolo. With that said, it's safe to say that Lacane Crispin was raised to produce heirs and only learned to act like a lady, a housewife, and a broodmare at the same time. However, Lacane keeps a secret that makes her lose control at inopportune moments, and we won't know what that is just yet. At night, after spending hours writing his erotic fanfic between Misa and Lacane, Eric's head is pounding while showing off his abs for no reason. This mental overload is happening because his father can't go 2 days without cheating, so much so that he doesn't even remember the last time he showed up in this manhwa. Moreover, Eric was concerned with military matters, so he left the entire family business in the hands of the fall guy, his son. Another issue that is causing a lot of concern is the prolonged war devastating everything around the territory, and it is affecting food distribution so much that many families will have to go on a forced diet this summer. The idea is for these people to survive until autumn, because by then, the farmers fighting in the war will be able to return to their lives in the fields and stabilize the harvests. Despite having been a protagonist in the war, all the Cladnese received was the Halleck iron mine, which was built with customer service in mind, complete with a telephone service and everything. Besides that, they were given another mine as a bonus, Misa, of course. The problem is that the Halleck mine will take a while to develop, and they need food right now. Since the king doesn't give a damn about this issue, the family has to fend for itself to get food. While reflecting on these issues, Eric sees his wife wake up. It's not that this trouble is a severe financial problem, but his father's absence from the kingdom's premises makes his servants start looking at the son less kindly, so to speak. Because of this, young Eric feels like he's trapped in a coffin where a fart becomes a chemical weapon. Interrupted in the middle of his reflection, Eric sees Misa climb into his lap like a giant baby. For a moment, Amberic's face comes to Eric's mind, but not because of some bizarre fetish. In fact, he realizes that the guy doesn't understand Eric's relationship with Misa because not even Eric understands it. Then, the little girl lets out a soft moan like a baby asking for something. Eric thinks it's some kind of marble on the table, apparently edible, so he pops it into the poor thing's mouth. In a way, Eric feels grateful that Misa hasn't run away or filed a restraining order. Because isn't it crazy how this guy has developed an insane attachment to the hen? The next day, the maids in the mansion go to tell Thaliasa that Misa dropped a handkerchief. In social circles, handkerchiefs were given and received as a gesture of affection between men and women. If a maiden drops her handkerchief in the house of her ex-fiancé, who is now married, the situation is serious. Upon hearing this, Thaliasa orders all the maids in the house to gather to look for the handkerchief. And if any unwanted rumors spread, they should all say the handkerchief belongs to the lady of the house. Without delay, the maids scatter throughout the mansion in search of the damn cloth. Malika, who isn't dumb, calls a younger maid aside to hatch schemes. Farther away, the younger maid comments that this woman must be dealt with within 2 years at most, so Malika replies that it could be done by tomorrow if she wanted. The other thinks it won't be that easy to pull off, but either way, it's good that the two of them stay in frequent contact since she won't be able to keep making excuses to visit Malika at the Duke's house. That said, Malika figures this issue could be discussed in the city, so she decides to arrange another meeting between the two of them. Returning to the mansion, Thaliasa tells the maids that there will be a family dinner for a change, so she would love for Misa to stay calm for the event instead of eating everything in sight, as she usually does. Anyway, Thaliasa seems to have developed some affection for the princess, as she genuinely praises her twig-like neck and her beautiful silky hair. Amid this, Margrave shows up again for dinner. Once again, as is no surprise to anyone, Misa is causing a ruckus by scraping her fork on the plate without mercy, driving the guy crazy. Thaliasa asks her husband to be a little patient, while Eric takes the girl's hand to teach her how to eat like a person. Margrave has a fit, saying that this woman is not a baby to be treated like one, although she acts like one. So his wife replies that it's best to just ignore the girl, just like she ignores him. Upon hearing this, the guy goes off the rails and orders his wife to apologize, but she completely ignores him and asks Eric to make sure the princess is eating her vegetables. Since that's how things are, the alpha male of this pigsty slams his fork on the table and reminds everyone that they will soon receive his majesty, so they better make sure that the sister of that soulless man is without a single scratch. After saying this, Margrave Cladney storms out of dinner without looking back. And since the king really is coming in a few days, Thaliasa asks if her son has prepared the gifts to take to the palace, and he confirms that he has. And why does this blessed king need to set foot in the Cladney mansion? Because in the kingdom of Esquilor, it is customary for couples to visit their parents' homes 50 days after marriage. For Misa and Eric, that meant the royal palace. Days later, that's where the lovebirds were headed, in their carriage with the usual servants, including Malika, who was communicating in ancient Aramaic with some unknown ancient entity, or so it seemed. Wearing his noble, tacky outfit, Eric accompanied his sleepy wife inside the carriage, reflecting that when he was on the verge of giving up on marriage, he ended up finding a little sweetheart to call his own. How lovely. The problem is that she doesn't even know he exists, but it's like that SCU Jorge song. I'm dating that girl, but I don't know if she's dating me. Anyway, having to protect the woman gives the hunk a good feeling, so that already makes everything else worth it. In fact, he even asks if the girl knows him, but as we can all assume, she doesn't respond. In the middle of this nonsense, Malika barges into the carriage with her face full of disgust and absolute contempt, as usual. After all, it's time to travel, so the driver shifts into first gear and sets off toward the royal palace. Some unknown time later, Eric and Misa are guided by a man through the vast corridors of that gigantic structure, where the bright sunlight pouring through the windows contrasts with the cold, gray marble that adorned the place. In Eric's mind, it seems like a decoration meant to humiliate the poor and intimidate the rich. Moreover, remembering how the king is, this castle looks more like the final boss level. Speaking of him, the young monarch received his crown 20 years ago and established his power easily, aided by his powerful maternal family, the Salakis. However, 12 years ago, when many people were absent due to the war, the king started acting like the mad sociopath that he is. One day, during that time, the floors of the central palace were stained with blood, and before the blood could be cleaned, another head rolled. For these reasons, Eric feels like his rear end is locked up tight as he approaches the throne room. Regardless, he has to make this damn visit, so the door opens, and there's a nervous Eric keeping his injured wife on her feet while he greets His Majesty. In response, King Mayor Malik, with his insufferable spoiled brat face, points out that his sister's face looks even prettier than the last time he saw her. However, as soon as the young man lets go of the girl's shoulder for a second, she collapses to the ground and goes dizzy. Mayor Malik notes that his sister's skin has improved significantly, along with her resilience to falling on her back. Given the good health she's showing, the king asks if he can expect news of a baby soon. For his part, in an attempt to avoid the king's suspicion, Eric responds that he's already locked and loaded, but it's not entirely up to him. Even though he said that, the truth is that Eric doesn't want to get involved with someone who doesn't even know what she's doing, especially considering the poor girl would get pregnant, which would be a massive mistake, if not a crime. Thinking about this, he argues that Misa's health isn't quite there yet, but Mayor Malik doesn't want to hear any of that beta nonsense, because his servants have already brought up a much more interesting topic. After all, they just ratted out to the king that even though the evidence of intercourse between Misa and Eric was a blood-stained cloth, when the maids cleaned it, they discovered that the lady's privates were intact. Furthermore, the sheets used in the supposed act were impeccably clean, with no signs of hanky-panky, no fishy smell, or strange fluids oozing from the privates. Faced with these facts, Mayor Malik would love to know if Eric is, by any chance, unhappy being married to an heiress of royal blood. Eric responds as if he's chewing a hamburger, so the king tells him to spit out the egg and speak up, mentioning that the Lord hasn't even touched the princess. Given that, does Eric intend to go to the priest and ask for a national annulment? Well, Eric lowers his head and replies that it's not possible. Inside, he regrets that his servants have reached the point of betraying him. In the end, the king accuses Eric of having lied to the royal family, involving his dear and so well-treated Misa, who is still lying on the floor without a shred of help. However, this isn't just a matter of a simple mistake. With all his words, Mayor Malik questions if this is a case of royal betrayal. At that moment, Eric's guts tighten, and he trembles at his core because an accusation of this magnitude doesn't mean only he would be sent to the grave, but the entire Chladni family and its employees would go down in a master combo package of death. After all, Eric only has 70 knights with him at the palace, which means all of them would easily be crushed by the royal guard. Amid this, Mayor Malik calls his little sister over, and she obeys like a good Doberman. He then asks if her husband undressed her that night, but she doesn't answer. Seriously? Faced with this, the king loses it and yanks the poor girl's hair hard. Eric tries to stop His Majesty, but Mayor Malik insists on the same question, this time with twice the volume as before, still hurting the girl. It's then that, in the heat of the moment, Misa lets her head fall back as she's pulled and utters the following word in deep pain. Hurts? At that, everyone around watches the scene intently, some apprehensive, others with a strange pleasure at the princess's suffering. She points to her private parts and affirms that it hurts. Eric is at a loss to hear his wife speak for the first time, and with all the humiliation and rage he feels, a mix of emotions rushes through his body like adrenaline. Finally, Mayor Malik tells the woman to stop because it stopped being funny when his sister started revealing the intimacies she had with the hunk. And, just to keep the habit going. This spawn of Satan delivers a clean shot to Misa's face, prompting Eric to rush to her aid. The anger could be seen on his face, along with the feeling of helplessness from being challenged by the king himself. After such a pleasant encounter, Eric's convoy prepares to return home aboard a Volkswagen Model Year 1512 with 4 horsepower and a master-sized trunk on the roof. Inside, Eric held his wife in his arms, watching her sleep after taking a good slap to the face. Upon returning to the Chladni mansion, Eric is greeted by a butler, but he immediately says that he will be the one taking care of Misa today and no one else. So, if anyone comes near the West Wing on the 2nd floor, they'll become bird food. As for the butler, the Lord orders him to call Cullen and ask him to stand guard at this wing and shout, "No one's going up," just like Captain Nascimento, to anyone who dares set foot on the stairs. When he enters the house, Misa starts writhing and kicking like crazy, until Cullen drops in to respond to the colonel's call. Eric explains that part about Captain Nascimento to his right-hand man, then takes his wife inside the bedroom, puts her in bed, and makes sure no one will hear her. Therefore, no matter how much she cries, no matter how much she screams, no matter how much she plays Britney Spears' Toxic at full blast like she did last Friday night, no one will hear, no one will care, everyone will shrug it off. That being the case, Eric tells the woman to start talking, because now he knows she can speak. Not knowing how to react, the princess growls bizarrely and smiles awkwardly, like someone caught in the act, but she remains silent. Since that's how things are, Eric goes the fundamentalist evangelical route and decides to wait. And then, dude, you won't believe it. The girl actually spoke. I'd rather not pay attention to Misa. Misa doesn't want your attention either. Faced with the facts laid on his table like a stun followed by critical damage, the playboy is severely puzzled by the situation. With his mind in shambles, he gathers strength to question what Misa did in front of the king earlier, and she recites the following words. "Let's look for meat like hyenas, so we have a show, we're fine." Eric knew he had heard that phrase somewhere, but he couldn't remember exactly where. Unlike the gentle face and relaxed voice of the princess, the Lord's hands trembled with tension. He drops the woman and admits that he didn't want to pressure her, although he did so without remorse. Then again, the wench had simply pretended to be a human casserole all this time, and now she comes out speaking as if nothing had happened. For this reason, Eric wonders what goes on inside that fried little head. After all, when she was an 8-year-old girl, Misa saw her mother die, and later saw her half-brothers killed by the king. So the poor thing went bonkers, especially since, as if witnessing those horrors wasn't enough, she was despised and mistreated her whole life. Thinking about the miserable existence of this human project, Eric loses his breath. Considering that he had just discovered her ability to communicate, should he console his beloved somehow, hugging her and saying that all those years of humiliation were as unjust as the 2021 Libertadores final? Or would anything he said sound superficial in the face of such a deep and delicate issue? Well, one way or another, the big guy mentally melts down, unable to take a clear stance because he even wanted to say something, but what the hell would he say in a situation as hardcore as this? Dude, it's just not possible. When morning comes again, Eric receives a butler in his room with a meal, along with Malika, the pesky maid. The maid approaches the princess and says that she should stop imitating a beetle engine and start imitating a starving wild boar. Meanwhile, Eric chats with his ellipsis balloon, imagining that this woman would be executed for giving false information to the king, but then he remembered that bad people always die late. By the way, he tells the minx to let his wife sleep a little longer because the sound of her dying bear snores serves as ASMR for him. Fed up with his miserable life, Malika leaves the room. The butler invites the Lord to have a bite before starting the day's tasks, while the Lord reflects inside his vegetative head that, apparently, the servants came to see if he and Misa had consummated the marriage, if you catch my drift, but maybe it was better for them to think that way. So, Eric Chladni takes a seat after the butler's kind invitation and devours the meat with gusto. Or rather, without taste, because according to Eric himself, a meal I ate alone after so long was as dry as sand. Later, when it was still morning but later than earlier, we see a plate of food being thrown like a frisbee for no apparent reason. Ironically, the manga shows us a supposed list of Misa's chores for the day. First, because of pandemonium on the table. Second, eat the clothes left by the black-haired man, especially the boxers with the dark chocolate. Third, pull the white hair of the middle-aged maid with the potty mouth. Fourth, get beaten for it. Anyway, these activities have already fulfilled half the daily quota. and Misa ended up getting the worst of it in the end. But that's part of the disruptive and delinquent experience. She has been living in this crazy household with her antics. Now, there's a little problem. What if the black-haired dude spills her secret to everyone? After all, he seemed pretty mad at her yesterday, so he might snitch on the girl without mercy, and then Misa's life will become total hell. However, even though she's a heartless scoundrel, Misa knows that Eric is a very nice and goofy guy, just the way she likes it. A beta who hasn't taken the anti-Otario manual course, because while he might be goofy, he's not a fool. Anyway, prevention is better than cure, and that's what Misa decides to act on. So, she hurries over to Thalliasa, and the matriarch reminds the princess that it's not a good idea to rush out without the company of a maid with good physical conditioning. Then, the girl jumps into the woman's lap, using the recently acquired affection she gained from Thalliasa. Since she didn't take a punch to the head, Misa can assume the Duchess is still cool and hasn't heard any dirty little secrets. That being the case, the lady asks the butler to continue the boring conversation. So he informs them that, regarding the material change to repair the garden fence, he thought of using Majo wood, as it costs 2 jerry per carol, whatever the hell that means. Eavesdropping on the conversation, Misa ponders that the palace garden uses Zayden wood imported from the southern islands, but it's 5 times more expensive, 10 jerry per carol, so she figures Zayden is too expensive for this family of broke nobodies. By the way, the butler notes that the Rogeton family's dairy farm recently started producing butter and cheese, and although it costs an arm and a leg, the servant brought a little bit for the lady to taste. The butter costs 20 pazel per del. Jesus Christ, what's that? So Misa is shocked that this small amount costs 20 pazel. At that moment, Thalliasa stuffs some butter into the girl's mouth, while she remembers that a sack of flour costs 20 pazel, so this piece of butter costs the same as a sack of flour, or all of Argentina. Now she understands why the medieval kin was so worried about food. The guy thinks beans and rice are worth gold in this place. But if money is tight, it would be a good idea to buy flour since you can't eat Argentina. By the way, Thalliasa praises the princess's recent diet and says it would be great to get 5 del of that for her. The problem is that it costs 20 pazel, whereas the margarine they buy at Big Ode's grocery only costs 4. Amid this information, Misa uses the brain God gave her to do the math, while realizing that these people enjoy watching her eat, like she's an animal in a zoo. But at least they're happy with something related to her, right? Because let's say that other people, like the delinquent king and his troublemaking maids, don't see her with the same fondness. Later, in the late afternoon, when it's still day, but already afternoon, Misa is called by the Lord with the chiseled pecs, but she's quite comfortable in his mother's lap and isn't thinking of getting up. Even Thalliasa finds the girl's behavior strange, not realizing that the princess just doesn't want to stay with that cursed loser. Still, Eric has an incomparable talent for scooping up his wife into his arms, and that's exactly what he does using that technique. After doing so, he says softly, just for my ease in ya, that it would be better if she stayed very quiet because he hasn't told anyone that she can talk. Hearing this, the girl sheds a tear from her scalp from sheer emotion. With nightfall, which is not morning or afternoon, but after the afternoon and long after the morning, a dead lobster adorned the bourgeois table. Eric asks if Misa can eat by herself now or if she will continue the foolishness. Internally, the woman concludes that she definitely doesn't like this man and his ridiculous playboy formalities. Plus, these stupid servants always bring forks and knives when she'd much rather eat with her hands. Doing the math, Misa hasn't eaten with cutlery in 10 years, which is why she has a grotesque difficulty acting like a civilized citizen. However, Eric seems to have enjoyed the blonde's performance. At least that's what he said. Weird, this Eric, weird. Misa thinks as she lets the fork drop to the floor and dives into the food like an orangutan. Seeing this, the man gets angry and wants to know what's going on in the wench's head this time. Well, this time it's this. Misa can't just start eating like a person and risk the maids witnessing this scene. It would be too suspicious, of course. On the other side of the table, Eric is not happy at all with the woman's animalistic behavior resurfacing. So he holds his head in his hands and tells his wife to stop this nonsense immediately. Next, he grabs his chair, inspired by Datina, but he gives up on making Misa the Pablo Markel of Esquilor and sits beside her. Then, to her surprise, the Lord wipes her face with toilet paper, asking if that's what he's supposed to do, to keep wiping her face and feeding her as always. Faced with this question, Misa convinces herself that the guy isn't so bad after all. Then, Eric takes the girl's hand so that it, too, can go through the love car wash. Still at night, when it's a bit later than it was a few minutes ago, some maids clear the table, while others bathe the fake beast. After dumping a basin of cold water on the animal's head, Malika asks how this girl never catches a cold. The princess finds it strange that the skinny maid is taking on this role, since she usually leaves the bath to the chubby one. Anyway, revenge is a dish best served cold. And since the bathwater is as cold as hell, Misa decides to yank the hair of her main enemy with all the strength her animalistic body allows. Malika doesn't take it lying down and goes after the princess, so Eric steps in to stop the dogfight that has broken out in the bathroom. Malika justifies that the princess started it, so she had to react violently to preserve her life. And if Misa ends up with a broken rib, it's because she hit the edge of the tub. Hearing that, the nobleman is full-on pissed at the audacity of that daughter of a tramp. And besides, Malika still wants to keep bathing her, so Eric puts his foot down and decides to bathe his beloved without any extra help. Malika argues that this is something a naughty boy would do, and that Misa could drown because men aren't suited for these things. Not that she wouldn't want that to happen. Moreover, it's a lot of work to wash the girl's hair with all that oil and conditioner. Hearing that, Misa is upset, knowing full well that this creep only washes her with soap. But at least it's better than when they used to bathe her at the palace, because there they use caustic soda and boiling cooking oil. But either way, Eric doesn't back down and tells Malika Maloka to get lost, so the maid is successfully kicked out of the server. After getting rid of the brat, Eric asks if Misa can finish her bath on her own, because he's just reached an awesome level in Need for Speed, but the annoying one already says she can't manage things on her own. After all, she still needs to pretend to be a savage. Plus, it would be awesome to get a handful from a handsome big man on her naked body. Since that's the case, even though he's dying of embarrassment, Eric pretends to understand and asks for just a moment to take care of something real quick. Misa wonders what this creepy guy is up to this time, imagining that the jerk is going to grab a belt to whip her. But since she can't keep bothering the poor guy all the time, the big girl decides to calm things down before he spills the beans. With that in mind, she gets up from the tub and shows off her sculpted body for the hunk to check out, although he's not a big fan of the female anatomy, so he turns his head. Misa is doing this because this man might reveal her secret, but that's not all. The first time she saw his figure resembling Henry Cavill's Superman physique, she decided it wasn't good to keep messing with him all the time. With that in mind, as she displays her body covered in grotesque scars, Misa remembers the beating she took from her brother, while trying to calm herself down given the circumstances, because standing before her wasn't a sadistic scumbag, but rather a gentle giant. Still, no matter how hard she tries to convince herself of this narrative, Misa can't feel comfortable in this situation because, besides being traumatized to her last hair, the girl loves to stir up the lives of others, which leads to a terrible spiritual struggle that makes her sit on the cold floor without even realizing it. Witnessing that dramatic drama, Eric wonders what kind of beating the poor thing took to end up with such bizarre marks, or who did that to her, or who in the world could commit such an atrocity and still manage to sleep when their head hits the pillow. Faced with these questions, Misa realizes that the guy genuinely cares about her, so she finally decides to speak up. Using just one word, she utters, "King." But that, my friend, is a story for the continuation of the video.